Like and follow if you love horror. George couldn't get a solid count of the citizens that showed up. Maybe about 35, maybe less. For the moment, there wasn't anyone from the sheriff's department, but time was ticking. The cramped meeting hall was no more than a double wide attached to the side of a brownstone church that was now the city hall. He was glad to see several citizens had brought firearms. He'd certain they'd need them. One thing concerned him. He didn't see a single face on the stack of missing persons flyers pilfered from Gershwin. Was it possible they knew what George was up to? George shook his head. He didn't even know what he was up to. "Thank you for coming," George said loudly to settle the crowd and capture their attention. "I'm not from here, but I'm no stranger to these parts, and I'm familiar to most of you. Name's George for everyone else? Since before I showed up, some kids got missing. Some of you may already know I went after one myself. I know how news carries in a small town. Two things caught me as curious. The boy I tried to rescue last night was scared, worried that something was after him right before he disappeared. Next thing, I was informed that this was not an isolated case and that Sheriff Ethel Clintock had been sitting on his thumbs. Everyone who's missing is turned up," Gershwin yelled so loud from the back that he spasmed. "Not everyone, not yet," George said calmly, while Robert leaned in on Gershwin to signal a demand for him to cooperate. "There have been 22 disappearances. The first 14 have been accounted for according to records. That leaves 8 unaccounted for, 2 of whom have been gone for about a week." There was a murmur in the crowd. Popping out for a party for a couple of days was one thing. Not being seen for over a week was another. George continued. "Now, I'm not about to throw some kind of accusation on the behavior of the sheriff without some kind of information giving me a reason. I've been told the first 2 who disappeared were Dane Clintock, the sheriff's son, and his date Amber Dietz. I think that constitutes enough of a conflict of interest to involve an outside authority." "That's pure speculation," Gershwin jerked away from Roberts. Roberts quickly moved in front of him. The two began bickering in an angry whisper. The locals began to get riled. Many were furious that an outsider, even one as familiar as George, would accuse the town sheriff of impropriety. Others feared conspiracy had gripped their children. Even a few angrily rejected the idea of outside authorities mucking about in their affairs. "Listen, please," George tried to command the group's attention. "I know this is hard to accept. Last night my cabin up on the preserve was attacked. One of the attackers I can positively identify as a high schooler named Carlos, who I know is close to Dean. I witnessed the 2 being chummy the other day." The group looked around at each other as a low murmur rolled through the crowd again. "All I'm proposing is that we get a couple people, maybe some state boys, go up into the mountains and look. Nothing crazy." George tried to hold an easy tone so as not to get the room whipped up into a frenzy. "Some of us are already armed. We have a pretty good idea of the general territory we need to cover. The door swung open and Sheriff Clintock's voice cut in. His eyes immediately landed on George. "Why am I not fucking surprised? Give me one goddamn good reason I shouldn't haul your ass out of here in cuffs." The crowd went silent, but they watched the sheriff with uncertainty. George couldn't be sure if his words inspired anyone in the crowd. Several deputies entered behind the sheriff, both with hands hipped over their sidearms. This was, unfortunately, the perfect time for Gershwin to make a scene. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest those 3. Gershwin thrust a finger at George, Patty, and Bronson in turn. "They threatened me, they held me hostage, and they stole official town documents." The mayor rolled his eyes. "Belay that." He began simply. "God damn it, Gershwin, shut the fuck up." He turned his head to stare down the clerk. "Sheriff, if I may, we have a couple questions." "Robert, what the fuck is this all about?" Sheriff Clintock gestured angrily at George while keeping a focus on Robert. There have been some rising concerns about the disappearances, Robert began. Eckel, have you seen any strange behaviors out of your son or his friends? Now, what exactly is that supposed to mean? Sheriff moved in on Robert. Before he could get close, several armed men and women stepped in his way, the deputies matching formation. No, no, we can't start a shootout here. George worried everything could go the wrong way, but he figured he'd be a target. Everything went black. The hall filled with a scramble of screams, commands, confusion, and the chambering of many rounds into many guns. Thankfully, anyone with half a brain pulled out a flashlight or a cell phone. They gave the hall a subtle, dull glow, enough for people to get their bearings. Unfortunately, once they did, guns were aimed. Robert stepped into the middle and held up his hands. George and Patty called from the front, trying to implore reason. Then something caught George's eye. The beam of a flashlight glanced over a cluster of glossy black orbs beyond the window. Shit, they're here! George yelled this. We need to get everyone organized. Babe, clear a lane for George, Patty said to Bronson. Can do, George. With him... God damn it. With him at his back, Bronson pushed to the middle of the crowd where Robert was nearly nose to nose with the sheriff. God damn it, you two, we can't afford to have this kind of bullshit. He barked at them. Someone cut the goddamn power. Likely the same fuckers who attacked us last night. Can't you two see what's going on here? Get everyone in the middle for safety. The only thing I see here is you riling up the town against me, the sheriff barked back. Well, I tell you what. You're about to get a good chance to prove your loyalty pretty damn quickly. Now get everyone in the middle of the goddamn room. We're under fucking attack. George was at the peak of his temper. His nerves were completely shot, and he felt backed into a corner. He never wanted to shoot a man, least of all a cop. But that was a point he wasn't above. Robert, the sheriff, Bronson, Patty, and George worked quickly to calm the crowd and get guns aimed outward at the windows. Nothing could have prepared the crowd for what came next. A hailstorm of bullets ripped through the hole. Anyone might as well try navigating by the light of fireworks with your ears ringing like the feedback of a speaker. Shadows descended on the crowd. There were muffled screams, people dropping left and right, the warm, wet spray of blood, and that smell like being face first into a wasp nest. It was madness. We're not going to last here, Patty belted out as shooters fell. Patty picked up guns and redistributed them. We need to escape. Door to the church, up the stairs, Robert called out. The group began desperately pressing for the doors as people around them dropped. They could tell some were being dragged off alive. Others thrashed about on the ground, seemingly in silent agony. Perhaps shot? Then George noticed some of the people who were once shooting out had turned their guns and were now shooting in. Was it in confusion? By the time the remaining survivors made it to the door, it was just Patty, Bronson, George, Robert, and Sheriff Clintock. The five pushed back through the door, not thinking to turn around. Bronson let out a gasp. Patty and George spun around to see a long tendril extending from the back of Bronson's neck. It pulled back towards a bulbous, shadowy outline of a natural figure. With a few features highlighted in the streetlight outside, it looked tumorous. Many more tendrils held up the shadowy alien form, and a cluster of glossy orbs peered through the darkness at Patty and George. The fuck? George said before unloading on the creature. Patty joined in with a feral cry. Robert moved to check in on Bronson, but as he did, Bronson grabbed him by the throat and threw him against the wall. Now the only person still shouting into the meeting hall was the sheriff. Patty and George leapt on Bronson and pulled him off of Robert. Bronson flung Patty aside. George and Robert fought to gain control over the large man. While Bronson might have been larger than George, to say he was easily stronger was a stiff underestimation of George. However, even George and Robert combined, they didn't seem to match his now unnatural strength. George fought back to fight with George thought back to his fight with Carlos as he